When we speak of reverence in the house of God, we are not merely addressing the physical act of entering a sacred space. We are speaking of an inward posture, a spiritual attitude. The church, a place where heaven touches earth, is not just a building, but a living sanctuary where we come into direct communion with the divine. And yet, how often do we approach it without true reverence, distracted by the cares of the world or lost in thoughts that bear no relation to the holiness of the moment? This is a spiritual dilemma that many of us face. How to enter into the sanctuary of God with our hearts fully engaged, our minds freed from the noise of daily life. The true challenge lies not in the physical act of entering the church, but in preparing our hearts to meet God there. Imagine for a moment the temple in Jerusalem, where the sacredness of God's presence was so tangible that even the high priest could only enter the innermost part, the Holy of Holies, once a year. Such was the reverence for God's presence. And yet, as we read in the Gospel of Matthew, we see the example of Jesus driving out those who had turned the temple into a marketplace. "It is written," he said, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers." What a striking reminder that the house of God is not a place for worldly distractions. We too must come with a heart purified, free of the clutter that so often preoccupies us. Consider the life of Saint Francis of Assisi, a man whose heart was wholly attuned to God. Saint Francis, known for his simplicity and devotion, understood that entering a church meant entering into the presence of the divine. His reverence for sacred spaces was profound. Once, as he walked through a field near a chapel, he saw a group of people gathered around, laughing and chatting, their voices ringing out in the sacred space. He stood there for a moment, and with a deep sigh, he said, "This place is a house of God, and here we should find peace, not the distractions of the world." His life teaches us that entering the house of God means leaving behind all that would distract us from His presence, and instead carrying within us a heart full of awe and devotion. How often do we, like those in the marketplace, bring our distractions into the holy space, unaware of the sacredness that surrounds us? To prepare ourselves spiritually for the experience of worship, it is not enough simply to enter the building. We must cleanse our hearts, focusing our minds on the divine purpose of our gathering. A simple yet powerful practice is to take a few moments before entering the church to quiet the mind and still the heart. Stand outside the doors for a few moments, breathe deeply, and offer a prayer of preparation. A prayer such as this: "Lord, I come before you now with a heart that is heavy with the concerns of the world. Help me to lay them at your feet. Let your presence fill this space, and help me to enter it with a pure and open heart. Let me leave behind my distractions and come before you in reverence and peace." By offering such a prayer, we acknowledge that our hearts need cleansing, that we need God's help in turning our focus to Him. Through this prayer, we invite the Holy Spirit to guide our hearts into a posture of reverence and humility, preparing us to enter the sacred space with the proper attitude. Yet, even with such preparations, distractions still arise. How do we manage these moments when our minds wander during prayer, or when our thoughts drift to the concerns of the world? The key lies in cultivating a spirit of mindfulness. Every time our mind wanders, we gently bring it back to the presence of God, like a child learning to focus. In those moments, it can be helpful to use a prayer mantra, something simple like, "Lord, I am here." This short prayer helps to recenter us, reminding us of the sacred space in which we stand. What would it mean for our lives if we approached each service with the same reverence and attentiveness that St. Francis exhibited?
how much richer would our experience of God's presence be if we prepared ourselves with such intention? For those seeking to cultivate this reverence in their own lives, I encourage you to make it a practice to prepare yourself before entering the church, whether it is through prayer, silence, or simply taking a few deep breaths. Make space for God in your heart. This will not only enrich your experience of worship, but will draw you closer to the heart of God. If you desire to deepen your understanding of the sacred and learn how to more fully experience the presence of God, I invite you to subscribe for further spiritual insights and reflections. Let us continue this journey together, seeking to enter into God's presence with reverence and a heart full of faith. As we reflect on what is forbidden in the house of God, one of the greatest lessons we learn from Scripture is the importance of purity, both in our hearts and in our actions. When we enter into a church, we are not just walking into a physical space, but into the very presence of the Almighty. And how can we, with our imperfect hearts, enter into such a holy space without preparation? It is in the very act of purification, removing from our hearts and minds all that is unworthy, that we begin to understand the depth of reverence God desires from us.
When we walk into His house, we must leave behind all that seeks to separate us from His love and grace. Consider the life of Saint Mary Magdalene, who was once lost in the world, burdened by sin and shame. But when she encountered Jesus, everything changed. Her heart, once filled with regret and guilt, was purified by His love and mercy. She understood that to truly worship God, she had to first rid herself of the burden that weighed her down. She didn't approach the Lord with perfect purity, but with a contrite heart that desired to be made whole. And it was this very heart, humble, repentant, and open, that God honored. St. Mary Magdalene's story teaches us that purity is not about being free from all imperfections, but about the willingness to be cleansed by God's love. We too are called to come before God with such a heart that is open, vulnerable, and willing to be transformed. When we enter the church, we must ask ourselves, are we truly prepared to meet God? Are we ready to surrender our burdens, our distractions, and our sins so that we can be filled with His peace? There is a powerful prayer of purification that can help us prepare our hearts before entering the church. It is a prayer that acknowledges our need for God's cleansing power and His mercy. It goes like this: Lord, I come before you as I am, with all my imperfections, distractions, and sins. I ask you to cleanse my heart and mind, to purify me so that I may stand before you in reverence. Help me to leave behind everything that would separate me from you so that I can approach your house with a humble and sincere heart. This prayer is not just for the moments before we enter the church, but it is a prayer that we can make a regular part of our lives. It is a reminder that purification is an ongoing process. Every time we come before God, we must seek His help in cleansing us from all that is impure and unworthy. It is important to remember that purity is not about our own efforts to be flawless. The saints, especially those who are the greatest examples of holiness, were not people who lived without sin. Rather, they were people who acknowledged their need for God's grace and who strove, with His help, to live in alignment with His will. St. Augustine, one of the greatest Christian thinkers, once said, "God gives where He finds empty hands." It is only when we recognize our own spiritual poverty and acknowledge that we cannot purify ourselves that we open ourselves to the transformative power of God's grace. Purity of heart is also about our thoughts. How often do we let our minds wander during prayer or worship? How often do we enter the church, but our thoughts remain focused on everything but God? In Matthew 5:8, Jesus tells us, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." To see God, we must rid ourselves of the distractions that cloud our vision. We must train our minds to focus on the sacredness of the moment, to turn our thoughts away from the mundane, and to set our hearts on the divine. How, then, can we cultivate such purity? The answer lies in the practice of mindfulness and intentionality. Before entering the church, we can take a moment to quiet our minds, to let go of the distractions of the day, and to focus solely on the presence of God. We can pray for help in purifying our hearts, acknowledging that we are dependent on God's grace to clear away the clutter of our thoughts. Even during worship, when our minds begin to wander, we can gently bring our thoughts back to God, reminding ourselves of the purpose for which we have gathered. The act of purifying our hearts is not a one-time event, but an ongoing practice. Just as we would clean our house before welcoming a guest, we must also prepare our hearts before entering God's house. This process of purification, of clearing away the distractions and impurities, allows us to approach God in the spirit of humility and reverence that He desires. So, I ask you, what is it that distracts you from the Lord in His house? What is it that weighs on your heart, preventing you from fully encountering His presence? Take a moment to reflect on these things, and as you prepare to enter the sanctuary, offer them up to God. Ask Him to purify your heart, to cleanse your thoughts, and to help you approach His presence with reverence and awe. For those seeking to deepen their connection with God and cultivate purity in their lives, I invite you to continue to seek His guidance in every moment. Through prayer, reflection, and the desire for transformation, we can approach God's house with hearts that are pure, ready to encounter His love and grace. May God bless you as you seek His presence with a heart that is open, humble, and pure. As we continue our journey through understanding the sanctity of God's house, it becomes clear that there are not only internal preparations we must make, but also external actions that reflect our reverence. The prohibition of distractions and unholy acts is an essential part of cultivating a deep, meaningful worship experience. In the presence of God, we must silence the noise of the world and avoid actions that detract from the sacredness of the space. When we are in the house of the Lord, it is not merely a place for casual conversation or mundane actions. It is a space for sacred communion, a place where our hearts should be fully attuned to God's presence. The question we must ask ourselves is this: what are the distractions and actions that prevent us from entering into true worship? We live in a world filled with noise, distractions, and constant activity. It is not difficult to find our minds wandering, even in the midst of prayer or worship. It is easy for our hearts to be drawn away by the concerns of life, financial worries, relational difficulties, personal ambitions.
These distractions are not inherently bad, but when they invade our time with God, they disrupt our ability to fully connect with Him. St. John Chrysostom, one of the great church fathers, wrote extensively about the importance of focusing our minds and hearts on God during the Divine Liturgy. He emphasized that worship should be a deeply concentrated act, free from the interruptions of worldly thoughts. He once said, "When you are in the church, let your soul be full of reverence, and let your body be in silence. For the grace of God cannot work in a distracted heart." These words are a reminder that our external actions, our posture, our silence, our attentiveness, reflect the interior disposition of our hearts. If we are distracted, it is likely that our hearts are not fully present with God. There is a simple yet profound practice that can help us prevent distractions during worship. Before entering the church, take a few moments to silence the noise of the world. This can be done through a short prayer or meditation. A prayer such as this can be a starting point. Lord, I come before you today with a heart full of distractions. Help me to quiet my mind, to silence the noise, and to focus my attention on you alone. Cleanse my heart from anything that would take my focus away from you. Fill me with your peace that I might be fully present in this sacred moment. It is in this moment of quieting our hearts that we allow ourselves to enter into true worship. When we remove distractions and open our hearts fully to God, we experience a deeper connection with Him. This practice is not just for when we enter the church, it is something we can practice throughout our daily lives. Every moment is an opportunity to return to a place of focused devotion where we align our hearts with the will of God. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus speaks of the importance of bringing our entire being into worship. In Matthew 15, verse 8, he says, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." This passage challenges us to ask ourselves, are we truly present in our worship, or are we simply going through the motions? How often do we stand in church, our lips moving in prayer, but our hearts distracted, our minds elsewhere? Jesus calls us to something deeper, a worship that comes from the heart, a worship that is not just a performance, but a sincere offering of our whole being to God. We see this same principle in the life of Saint Teresa of Avila, who was a mystic and a reformer of the Carmelite order. Saint Teresa often spoke about the importance of inner silence, of turning away from the noise of the world in order to cultivate a deeper relationship with God. She once wrote, "In the interior of the soul, where God dwells, the soul must remain alone and silent, for only in silence can the soul hear the voice of God."
Saint Teresa's words remind us that worship is not about what is outwardly seen or heard, but about the inner silence and attentiveness of the soul. When we silence our thoughts and actions, we make space for God to speak to us. One of the greatest distractions in our lives today is the constant flow of information. Phones, social media, news, and other forms of media constantly demand our attention. While these things are not inherently sinful, they can easily pull us away from a focused, intentional relationship with God. When we step into the house of God, we must make a conscious decision to leave behind the distractions of the world. This might mean turning off our phones, refraining from conversations that have no place in the sacred space, and choosing to focus solely on God during our time in church. This is not just about external actions. It is about an internal decision to quiet our minds and hearts so that we can enter into true communion with our Creator. A practical way to guard against distractions is to practice mindfulness in the moments leading up to worship. Take time before you enter the church to still your mind and heart. This could be as simple as taking a few deep breaths, recalling the presence of God, and making a conscious effort to let go of any anxieties or distractions that may be lingering in your thoughts. This simple act of preparation helps to set the tone for a deeper experience of worship. We may also find that our actions in church can become distractions in themselves. For example, unnecessary movement, talking, or restlessness can detract from the sacredness of the space. It is important to remember that worship is not a passive activity, but an active participation in the divine mystery. By maintaining a posture of reverence, standing, kneeling, or sitting attentively, we signal to our hearts and to God that we are fully present and engaged in the sacred act of worship. So, as you prepare for your next time in church, ask yourself, what distractions are keeping me from fully engaging with God? What thoughts or actions do I need to leave behind in order to approach His house with a heart that is undistracted and open? Take a moment to reflect on the ways you can better focus your heart and mind on God in the midst of worship. For those seeking to grow in reverence, I encourage you to practice intentional silence before and during worship. Turn away from distractions and open yourself to the presence of God. As you do, you will find that your worship becomes deeper, more meaningful, and more transformative. May the peace of God fill your heart as you enter His house, and may you experience the fullness of His presence in your worship. As we come to a deeper understanding of the sacredness of the church and the prohibitions that guide us toward a reverent worship, we must turn our attention to the spiritual foundation of all that we do in God's house.
There is a vital truth, clearly expressed throughout the Scriptures, that the church is not just a place for gathering, it is a place for encounter, for communion with God. It is a space where heaven touches earth and where we, as God's people, are invited to come into His presence with purity, attentiveness, and a heart full of reverence. But how do we truly come before God in His house? What is the deep spiritual principle that governs our approach to worship? In the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks to us of the true nature of worship. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. John 4:24. This verse is foundational to understanding how we are to approach worship in the church. To worship God in spirit and truth means that our worship is not just external, it is an inward reality. It is about aligning our hearts with the will of God, about entering into a deeper communion with Him through sincere devotion and humble reverence. In this sense, the physical building of the church is important, but it is the condition of our hearts that matters most. Saint Ignatius of Antioch, one of the early church fathers, understood the importance of the heart in worship. He wrote, "It is not the place that makes the church holy, but the presence of Christ that sanctifies the space." The church building itself is holy because it is consecrated for the worship of God, but it is the attitude of the heart that truly sanctifies the act of worship. When we come before God, we must come with hearts that are set apart, hearts that are focused not on external distractions, but on the profound reality of God's presence. Worship is, at its core, an act of the heart, an offering of ourselves, our attention, and our devotion to God. This is where the prohibition of distractions becomes so significant. When we enter the church, we are entering a sacred space, and we must leave behind anything that would distract us from fully encountering God. This includes not only our external distractions, but also our internal struggles, our anxieties, our burdens, our desires for worldly things. Jesus, in His teaching, often challenged His followers to abandon all that would separate them from the love of God. In Matthew 6:24, He said, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other." This verse calls us to examine the distractions of our hearts. Are we serving God with undivided devotion, or are we divided by the many things that call for our attention? Saint Benedict, the founder of the Benedictine monastic order, understood the importance of focusing the heart on God. He wrote in his Rule for Monks that nothing should be preferred to the work of God, which is worship. For Benedict, the life of a monk was one of simplicity and devotion.
In his rule, he emphasized the importance of avoiding distractions, both internal and external, so that one could give full attention to prayer, work, and the sacred. The same principle applies to all Christians. When we come into the house of God, we must give Him our full attention. We must clear our hearts and minds of anything that would distract us from offering ourselves to Him in worship. But how can we practically do this? One way is by practicing stillness and silence before we enter the church. A few moments of quiet reflection, either outside the church or in the moments before the service begins, can help center our hearts and minds on the purpose of worship. In those moments, we can offer a prayer like this: Lord, as I prepare to enter your house, I lay down all the worries of the world. Help me to focus my heart and mind solely on you. I leave behind all distractions and anxieties, and I open myself to your presence. May this time of worship be a true offering of my heart. Such a prayer helps us to prepare spiritually for worship, clearing away the distractions that would otherwise prevent us from entering fully into God's presence. But even in the midst of worship, distractions will arise. Thoughts about our daily lives, concerns for the future, or even discomforts in our bodies.
The key to overcoming these distractions is not to fight them with force, but to gently bring our focus back to God. Every time our minds wander, we return our attention to Him, reminding ourselves that we are in a sacred space and that He is worthy of our undivided attention. The Apostle Paul also speaks to this in his letter to the Philippians, encouraging them to set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. This is the heart of worship, setting our minds and hearts on God and allowing Him to be the focus of our attention. It is a practice that requires discipline and intentionality, but it is also a practice that brings us closer to the heart of God. When we focus on Him, when we make worship an act of the heart, we are transformed. We are brought into a deeper relationship with God, and in that relationship we find true peace. So I encourage you to reflect on your own approach to worship. Are there distractions in your heart or mind that prevent you from fully focusing on God?
How can you better prepare yourself for worship, leaving behind the noise of the world and entering into His presence with a heart full of reverence? Take time to practice stillness and silence before you enter the church and offer up a prayer of preparation. And when you are in worship, make an effort to return your focus to God every time your mind wanders. In this way, you will experience a deeper, more intimate communion with Him. May God bless you as you seek to enter His house with a pure heart, free from distractions, and may your worship be a true offering to Him. As we reflect on the sanctity of the church and the importance of entering into God's presence with a reverent heart, we come to realize that understanding the prohibitions of the church is not merely about adhering to a set of rules. It is about cultivating a deeper spiritual awareness and transformation. The prohibitions are not restrictions for the sake of control, but guideposts leading us toward a fuller experience of communion with God. And this final aspect of our reflection calls us to a profound realization. The act of worship in the church is not only about the space we enter, but about the state of our hearts as we approach it. It is about a continual process of spiritual growth and surrender, where we allow God's presence to shape and purify us. The invitation to worship in the church is, at its core, an invitation to transformation. Every moment spent in God's presence has the potential to change us, to mold us into the image of Christ. But in order to experience this transformation, we must be willing to let go of the distractions, the attachments, and the sinful tendencies that so often keep us distant from God. St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, writes, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind." Romans 12:2. This transformation is not something that happens all at once, but it is an ongoing process, a continual surrender of our will to God's. In the act of worship, we are invited to participate in this transformation, allowing the Spirit of God to renew us, to purify us, and to draw us closer to the heart of the Father. St. John of the Cross, the great mystic and spiritual teacher, often spoke of the need for inner transformation in the spiritual life. He described the process of purification as a dark night of the soul, a period in which the soul is stripped of worldly attachments and purified to encounter the divine. This purification is not easy, but it is necessary if we are to fully experience the presence of God. In his writings, St. John said, "The soul that is purified becomes, through God's grace, like the Blessed Virgin, pure and immaculate." In this sense, the prohibitions of the Church serve as a means of purification. They are not barriers that separate us from God, but instruments that lead us toward a deeper, more intimate relationship with Him.
As we learn to avoid distractions and unholy acts, we create space within ourselves for God to work His transformation. It is important to note
that the transformation we seek in worship is not merely about external behavior. It is about the condition of our hearts. In Matthew 5:8, Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." This purity of heart is the key to true worship. It is not about outward perfection, but about an inner openness to God, a willingness to allow Him to cleanse and purify us. Saint Teresa of Avila, in her work The Interior Castle, emphasizes the importance of the heart's disposition in prayer and worship. She writes, "The interior of the soul is the place where the soul finds God, and the soul must be open and humble to receive His grace." This openness, this purity of heart, is what allows us to experience the transformative power of God's presence. One of the most practical ways to cultivate this openness is through prayer and reflection before entering the church. Just as we prepare ourselves physically for worship by putting on our best clothes or arriving on time, we must also prepare our hearts. This can be done through a simple prayer of surrender. Lord, I come before you with a heart that is often distracted and weighed down by sin. I surrender all that holds me back from fully entering into your presence. Cleanse me, Lord, and prepare my heart to receive your grace. May my worship be an offering of love and reverence to you alone. Such a prayer of surrender sets the tone for our time in worship. It acknowledges our need for God's grace and invites the Holy Spirit to work in us, purifying our hearts and minds. This is not a one-time prayer, but a continual act of surrender, a reminder that our spiritual growth is a lifelong journey. Every time we come before God, we are invited to be transformed by His presence. St. Augustine, in his Confessions, speaks of the transformative power of God's grace in the life of the believer. He writes, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." The restless heart is one that is constantly seeking fulfillment in the things of this world. But in worship, we are invited to find our rest in God alone. When we approach the church with a heart that is open to His transforming power, we experience a deep inner peace, a peace that comes not from external circumstances, but from the presence of God within us. As we continue our spiritual journey, let us reflect on the question, how can we prepare our hearts to receive God's transforming grace in worship? How can we make space for His presence in our lives, not only on Sundays, but in every moment? The prohibitions of the church are not meant to restrict us, but to lead us into a deeper, more intimate relationship with God.
When we learn to avoid distractions and unholy acts, we create room for God's grace to work in us, renewing our hearts and minds, and drawing us ever closer to His divine presence. In closing, I offer this prayer for all those seeking transformation through worship. Lord, as I stand in your presence, I ask for the strength to surrender all that hinders my relationship with you. May my worship be a true offering, and may your transforming grace work in me, making me more like you. Grant me the peace that comes from knowing you, and may I carry that peace with me into every area of my life. May God bless you with the grace to enter His house with a pure heart, and may His presence transform you more and more into the image of His Son, Jesus Christ.